Can you introduce yourself?
Ani bojo niji, benezi dijnikaswa jashk dorum michi sagi ganashnabek, ankwao dorum ganyigahaga hodnashoni, aldervil donjiba North Bay and Diana and Ashnabek and Dow. The name on my driver's license is Maurice Switzer, and on my status card, which also Canada thinks that I'm 16000870001. That's who Canada thinks I am. And I've lived in North Bay for about 22 years. My Indigenous roots are in the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation in Southern Ontario. And yeah, that's me.
Do you experience racism?
I have, and I do, and because I have a privileged position in society, which means that I'm more affluent and have some, belong to some organizations and have some profile, I don't experience very much in-your-face racism. Because bullies and bigots usually know enough to steer away from people that can cause them problems. But the racism that most people experience is what we call systemic racism. Canadians think that they're immune from the kind of racism that they think is typified by what happens in the United States. People using just incendiary language, although it's starting to happen in Canada. And they think it, what I call in-your-face racism. But systemic racism means that the systems of government, of education, of child welfare, of economics, all those systems were created by white men, usually Protestant white men, and those systems are still largely in place in this country 155 years after Canada officially became confederated. And I can give you lots of examples. There was a case within the last year of a grandfather taking his granddaughter into a bank in British Columbia and to open an account, and they experienced in-your-face racism because that the people in that bank branch did not think that Indigenous peoples, and they were more visible Indigenous than many, did not think that they belonged in their branch. And subsequently, of course, they had to issue all sorts of embarrassing apologies and whatnot. Systemic racism usually means that people don't think that Indigenous peoples are intelligent, are capable, and so even people of other people, racialized people, experience that kind of racism on a daily basis.
How would you characterize reconciliation?
Reconciliation should be getting back to the relationship that was envisaged when the first peoples came to this continent, and that was a relationship of equals. As a matter of fact, the newcomers that came here 400 and 500 years ago, they were terrified of being vastly outnumbered by the Indigenous peoples, and they were, subsequently, they were very humble in their dealings with them and respectful. And that was a nation-to-nation relationship of equals, not of one group being subservient to the other. And interestingly, that was despite the fact that the papal doctrine that blessed European exploration, countries like Italy, France, England at one time was a Catholic country, Portugal, Spain, those countries all functioned with the blessing of the Pope, which said, if you go anywhere in the world and you encounter people who do not believe what we believe, in other words, the Catholic faith or Christianity in general, you can treat their lands as terra nullius, empty lands. In other words, those people are not human. And in the words of some of those papal doctrines, they could be subject to perpetual servitude, slavery. And that issue came up again on a recent visit to Canada by Pope Francis, when he was asked again if the Church would, after 600 years, once and for all, revoke those doctrines. And they have not been revoked, and they are the underpinning of every colonized country in the world, of which there are many, including Canada and the United States. But interestingly, on the ground, when those first explorers like Cartier and Champlain first came to these lands, because they were terrified of being surrounded by people who were different from them, they did not put into effect that doctrine of discovery, and treated the indigenous peoples like they were their equals. So that's what reconciliation needs to be: is treating people as equals, respecting one another.
What has gone wrong with the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people?
The breakdown of that nation-to-nation relationship of mutual respect was pretty well coincidental with the change in the balance of population. Again, as long as the indigenous peoples greatly outnumbered the Europeans, the relationship was civil and respectful. But after the War of 1812, when Canada was invaded, the only war ever fought on in this nation, and Canada's defense force largely consisted of 10,000 Indigenous warriors. After that threat of war disappeared, the British, who were the major colonial and military power and European power in North America, really vastly increased the settlement. It wasn't too long after the War of 1812, about 30 years, that the number of European settlers, primarily British, vastly outnumbered the indigenous peoples, and that almost exactly marks the time when that relationship began to sour.
Who is responsible for reconciliation?
Every Canadian is responsible for reconciliation. Every Canadian has treaty rights. Those treaties reinforced the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to sovereignty in these lands, a sovereignty that was at least superficially recognized by the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and reinforced at the Great Treaty of Niagara in 1764. And those exercises are not seen by most Canadians as involving them, but those treaties that their ancestors asked for, that were to ask Indigenous peoples to share the land in which they had been the sole occupants since time immemorial. Those treaties that were made with Europeans, there was no expiry date. They were to last as long as the sun rises in the east. And every citizen of this country, Canada, has treaty rights. And they are responsible for that reconciliation. And as a matter of fact, since last July, every new citizen that takes the oath of citizenship in Canada has to swear, not just as in the past, allegiance to the Crown, the British Crown, and to uphold the laws of Canada, but they now have to swear to uphold and respect the treaty rights that are enshrined in Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. So it's everybody's responsibility. It's not just the governments, it's not just the provinces, it's every Canadian citizen inherits those treaty rights, and not just the rights, which they've enjoyed, but the responsibilities. And it's the responsibilities that Canadians are having difficulty in honoring.
What actions can contribute to reconciliation?
Well, the first thing is that every Canadian has to understand that as a citizen, they have obligations to do what those treaties called for. That means share in the wealth of this land called Canada, this country. And unfortunately, Indigenous peoples have had to resort to the court system to try to get Canadians to keep the promises that their ancestors made that are still legal and binding. And in our territory here, the Robinson-Huron Treaty, we are on Robinson-Huron Treaty lands here in North Bay. And the 30 First Nations involved in the Robinson-Huron Treaty have had to take governments of Canada and Ontario to court. That court case is still pending. And so far, two of the three sections of that case have been won by the Indigenous peoples, and the judge has agreed that, in fact, the governments of Ontario and Canada did promise that in addition to sharing the use of the land with the Indigenous occupants, that they would provide them an increasing share of the wealth of these territories. And companies like Vale Inco, for example, have taken trillions of dollars in mineral wealth out of these lands. And other forestry companies have taken billions and trillions of dollars in wealth out of these lands. And the 30,000, they call them beneficiaries, of the Indigenous beneficiaries of the Robinson-Huron Treaty are getting $4 a year. $4 a year. For 30,000 people, that's $120,000. That's less than one Inco miner makes a year in wages and benefits. That's not what the treaty called for, and Canada is in breach of its treaty promises, and it breaks the law, its own laws, every single day. That's what will have to be remedied before anybody can say reconciliation is really happening in Canada. There are all sorts of symbolic acts. There are even adding, to the oath of citizenship, that requirement to observe treaty rights. That's very symbolic, and it's ironically symbolic because the country that demands that new citizens make that promise, break that promise themselves every day. We've had Canada declare, as of last year, that September 30th will be a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Well, that's nice, but basically it gives employees governed by federal laws a day off. How does that advance reconciliation? In North Bay here, 700 municipal employees got the day off. There was no requirement on any of them to learn anything about Indigenous issues. Most of them are almost completely ignorant of those issues because they weren't taught in school. And the major positive aspect of reconciliation that is happening and responds to a couple of calls to action of the 94 issued in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report deal with education. And people like myself, people of my generation and younger, did not learn what Canada's true history was. They didn't learn anything about the treaties. They didn't learn anything about residential schools. They didn't learn anything about how Canadian warriors were Canada's defense force in the War of 1812. They didn't learn any of those things. And so that's one area in which reconciliation can be said to be really genuinely moving forward, is through our schools. But it's in the other areas that there needs to be a tremendous amount of work done. I'm told on September 30th, in which Indigenous peoples some of them call Orange Shirt Day because of a woman in British Columbia who had her orange shirt removed from her on her first day at residential school. Tim Hortons made orange donuts that day. Well, that's nice, but how does that make things better for Indigenous peoples? This beautiful carrying bag was crafted by a woman named Brenda Lee, who's a Cree woman from Alberta and who now lives in Nipissing First Nation territory. And she has learned the art of wampum belt making, and those wampum belts were very important in the treaty process. And she tanned the moose hide from which this bag is made, I asked her to make it. I didn't give her any instructions. I just told her what I was going to put in it. And she on her own beaded this tiny version of the Treaty of Niagara covenant chain wampum belt. Those are tiny, tiny beads. And I carry that belt and some others in this bag for all of the educational work I do, whether it's for schools, for government agencies. I had one session last fall during Ontario's Treaty Recognition Week where there were 8,000 people on the call, on a virtual call. So gradually Canadians are learning about these treaty responsibilities, which is a huge part of reconciliation. And now I will show you the actual version of the belt that I had made. It's about 6 feet long. It's made of 10,076 beads. These beads were traditionally made from the two shells, a quag shell, Quahog, which has a purple growth ring in it, only found in the northern Atlantic, and the whelk shell, which are white beads. And these were woven together, and these were the documents that Indigenous peoples used to represent major agreements. And this one, there's a 17 on one end and a 64 on the other. The date, 1764, was only really significant belts that they used any European images in, like dates. But the main thing about this belt, which was versions of which were given to the largest gathering of Indigenous leaders in the history of North America, of Turtle Island as we call it, was given by Sir William Johnson, the representative of the King of England and the sovereign of the largest European empire that ever existed. And Sir William Johnson's job was to ask those 2,000 or 3,000 Indigenous chiefs for permission to share their land. In the Treaty of Niagara, the image central is what I call a picture of reconciliation. One of those figures would represent the Europeans, in particular the British. One would represent the Indigenous peoples as the Royal Proclamation the previous year described them, the Indian tribes of North America. And I show this to children and I say, what does that mean, two people holding hands? And they all understand. It means peace, it means friendship, it means sharing. It means being allies in wartime and peace and friendship in peace times. And one of the significant things that you can see in those two figures is that including an image of the heart was extremely important for Indigenous peoples, because that meant trust, it meant honesty, it meant truth, and it meant that this is more than a real estate transaction. It was a moral obligation to keep the promises that were made. So this is what I say, if people want to see what reconciliation looks like, that's what it looks like. Okay.